The Nebraska sun hung merciless in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the endless prairie. Sarah's worn boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each labored step, the grit settling into the creases of her weathered dress. Her hand rested protectively over her rounded belly, now 6 months swollen with the child that had cost her everything. The wagon had disappeared into the horizon 3 hours ago, leaving nothing but wheel tracks in the dry earth and the echo of her sister's final words. "You made your choice, Sarah. Now live with it." She paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, tasting salt and desperation. The weight of the child seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile, pressing down on her already aching back. Her water had run out an hour ago, and the nearest settlement was still miles away, if she was even heading in the right direction. "Just keep walking," she whispered to herself, the same words she'd repeated like a prayer since dawn. One foot in front of the other. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant smoke. Sarah's eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of civilization, a farmhouse, a water well, anything that might offer refuge. The endless expanse of rolling hills mocked her desperation, offering nothing but more dust and dying daylight. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she forced herself forward. Behind her lay shame and rejection. Ahead lay the unknown, but the unknown, she reasoned, couldn't be worse than the certainty of death if she stopped. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Sarah's steps became more unsteady. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing its mother's distress. She pressed her hand against her side, feeling the sharp reminder of the life growing within her, a life that depended entirely on her survival. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the plains, though no clouds darkened the sky. Sarah's heart sank as she realized it wasn't thunder at all, but the rhythmic pounding of horse hooves growing closer. She turned, shading her eyes against the setting sun, and saw a lone rider approaching. Her first instinct was to run, but her body had nothing left to give. She stood frozen, watching as the silhouette grew larger, closer, until she could make out the form of a man on horseback, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hat pulled low over his eyes. The rider slowed his horse to a walk as he approached, and Sarah could see his face clearly now. Weather-beaten skin, sharp blue eyes, and the expression of quiet concern. He was older than her, maybe 35, with calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but gentle, tipping his hat, "you seem to be in a bit of trouble." Sarah's throat was too dry to speak. She nodded, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The man dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Name's James Morrison. I've got a farm about 2 miles north of here." He gestured toward a cluster of buildings barely visible in the distance. "You look like you could use some water and a place to rest." Sarah's voice cracked. "I don't have any money to pay you." James studied her for a long moment, taking in her dust-covered dress, her swollen belly, and the exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "Didn't ask for any," he said simply. "Can you ride?" Sarah nodded weakly, and James helped her up onto his horse before mounting behind her. As they rode toward his farm, she felt the first tears she'd allowed herself to shed all day. They weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of hope, of the possibility that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The farmhouse came into view as the last light faded from the sky. A modest wooden structure with a wraparound porch and warm light glowing from within. It looked like sanctuary. James Morrison's farmhouse was simple but clean, with whitewashed walls and furniture that spoke of functionality rather than decoration. As he helped Sarah down from his horse, she noticed his careful attention to her condition, how he supported her elbow, how he waited for her to steady herself before letting go. "Kitchen's through there," he said, nodding toward a doorway. "I'll get you some water and something to eat." Sarah stood in the main room, taking in the details of his life. A single-place setting on the wooden table, one chair by the fireplace, books stacked neatly on a shelf, more than she'd expected a farmer to own. The house was clean, but bore the unmistakable marks of a man living alone. "Sit," James said, returning with a glass of water and a plate of bread and cheese. "When's the last time you ate?" "Yesterday morning," Sarah admitted, accepting the glass gratefully. The water was cool and clean, and she had to force herself not to drink it all at once. James watched her eat with quiet intensity, his blue eyes studying her face. "You got a name?" "Sarah," she replied between bites. "Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Sarah Mitchell, you're welcome to stay the night. Got a spare room upstairs." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "If you don't mind my asking, how'd you come to be walking alone out here?" Sarah's hand moved to her belly, and she felt the familiar shame rise in her chest. "I was traveling with my sister's family. They decided I was too much of a burden. Because of the baby. Because I'm not married." The words came out harder than she intended. "Because I'm a disgrace to the family name." James was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his own glass of water. "Their loss," he said finally, "takes courage to bring a life into this world, married or not." "Dee." The simple acceptance in his voice broke something loose in Sarah's chest. She'd prepared herself for judgment, for the kinds of questions that came with assumptions about her character. Instead, she found only understanding. "I don't know where I'm going," she admitted. "I don't have anywhere to go." "You don't have to decide tonight," James said. "Sleep on it." Things looked different in the morning. He showed her to the spare room upstairs, a small but comfortable space with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Sarah stood at the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Nebraska sky. "Mr. Morrison?" she called softly as he headed back downstairs. "James," he corrected. "James, why are you helping me?" He paused in the doorway, his hat in his hands. "My wife died 2 years ago in childbirth," he said quietly. "Lost the baby too. I guess I couldn't stand to see another woman facing that alone." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm sorry. So am I." He looked at her for a moment longer. "But maybe some good can come from it yet." That night, Sarah lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the prairie, the distant call of coyotes, the whisper of wind through grass, the creak of the old house settling. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. Downstairs, James sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers. He'd spoken more words to Sarah Mitchell in one evening than he had to anyone in months. The loneliness that had become his constant companion seemed to have loosened its grip, if only slightly. He thought about Martha, about the dreams they'd shared for their farm, for children running through these rooms. The empty house had been his penance for surviving when she hadn't. But now, hearing footsteps overhead, feeling the presence of another person in his home, he wondered if maybe it was time to stop punishing himself for being alive. The sound of Sarah moving about upstairs, careful, quiet movements that spoke of someone trying not to be a burden, stirred something protective in his chest. He'd meant what he said about not having to decide tonight. But as he climbed the stairs to his own room, James Morrison found himself hoping she'd decide to stay. The smell of coffee and bacon woke Sarah before dawn. She'd slept more soundly than she had in weeks, her body finally allowing itself to rest in the safety of James's farmhouse. The baby had been active during the night, and she'd felt oddly comforted by the movements, as if the child inside her was responding to the security of their temporary shelter. She dressed carefully in her worn dress, wishing she had something cleaner to wear, and made her way downstairs to find James already preparing breakfast. The kitchen was filled with warm morning light, and she could see through the window that the sun was just beginning to paint the prairie in shades of gold. "Sleep well?" James asked, not looking up from the stove. "Better than I have in a long time," Sarah replied truthfully. "Thank you. Coffee's on the table. Breakfast will be ready in a minute." They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that comes between people who understand each other's need for quiet. Sarah watched James through her lashes, noting the way he moved with quiet efficiency, the careful way he kept his eyes averted when he thought she might need privacy. "I should be moving on today," she said finally, though the words felt heavy in her mouth. James paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Where to?" "I don't know. Maybe Denver. I heard there might be work there for women. Denver's a hard place for a woman alone, especially in your condition." Sarah's hand moved to her belly. "I can't impose on your kindness forever." "Who says it's an imposition?" James set down his fork and looked at her directly. "This house has been empty too long, could use someone to bring it back to life." "I don't understand." James stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about not having anywhere to go." He turned back to her. "What if you didn't have to go anywhere?" Sarah's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we could help each other. You need a place to stay, somewhere safe to have your baby. I need—" He paused, struggling with the words. "I need someone to remind me what it's like to be human again." "James, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering." He returned to the table, his blue eyes serious. "I know it's not conventional. I know people will talk. But I've got a good farm, steady income, and room enough for a family. Your baby would have a name, a home, a father." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to walk across the prairie alone to protect your child. I know you're proud enough to refuse charity and strong enough to keep going when most people would have given up." He leaned forward. "I know you're the kind of woman who deserves better than what life has given you so far. But marriage, it's not something to enter into lightly." "No, it's not." James's voice was steady, certain. "But it doesn't have to be about love, Sarah. It can be about partnership, about building something together. Maybe love comes later, maybe it doesn't. But respect, companionship, security, those are good foundations too." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "The baby isn't yours." "No, but it could be." James reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I lost my chance to be a father once. Maybe this is my chance to try again." The warmth of his hand on hers sent an unexpected flutter through Sarah's chest. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be treated with gentleness, with respect. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it. Say you'll stay long enough to decide if this could work." Sarah looked around the kitchen, imagining herself moving through these rooms, preparing meals, tending to a child. It was more than she dared to hope for. What would people say? Let them say what they want. I'm more concerned with what you say. That afternoon, James showed her around the farm. The barn was sturdy and well-maintained, the fields healthy and productive. He introduced her to the animals, a cow named Bessie, chickens that clucked contentedly in their coop, an old dog named Blue, who seemed to approve of her presence. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, watching the wind move through the wheat fields. "It's a good life," James replied. "Quiet, but good. There's a school in town for when the baby's older. Church on Sundays if you're inclined. Neighbors who mind their own business mostly." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for survival, but for actually living, for building something lasting. "James," she said, stopping in the yard, "if I stayed, if we did this thing, I'd want to be a real partner. Not just someone you're taking care of out of pity. I wouldn't have it any other way. And I'd want to contribute. I can cook, clean, tend a garden. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I know you're not." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the baby kick as if in encouragement. "Then yes, I'll stay. I'll marry you." James's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Sarah Morrison has a nice ring to it." "Yes," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "I think it does." The wedding was simple, held in the small church in town with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore a dress that James had bought for her, the first new clothing she'd owned in years. It was pale blue cotton, modest but well-made, and when she caught her reflection in the church window, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her. James stood beside her in his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his hands steady as he placed the simple gold band on her finger. The vows were traditional, but when he spoke the words, "to have and to hold," his voice carried a conviction that made Sarah's heart flutter. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher said, and James leaned down to press a gentle kiss to her lips. It was brief, respectful, but Sarah felt something warm and promising in the contact. The town's reaction was mixed, as they'd expected. Some viewed James's marriage to a pregnant stranger with suspicion and disapproval. Others saw it as an act of Christian charity that reflected well on his character. Sarah learned to hold her head high when she walked down Main Street, James's presence beside her providing the strength she needed to face the whispers and stares. Mrs. Henderson, from the general store, was the first to openly welcome her. "Takes courage to start over," she said, pressing a small package of tea into Sarah's hands. "James is a good man. You're lucky to have found each other." As September turned to October, Sarah settled into the rhythms of farm life. She tended the vegetable garden, preserved vegetables for winter, and learned to milk Bessie. The physical work felt good, grounding her in the present moment instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. James was patient with her, showing her how to manage the household accounts, teaching her to read the weather signs in the sky. They developed an easy partnership, working side by side during the day and sharing quiet evenings by the fireplace. "Tell me about the baby's father," James said one evening as they sat together, Sarah's sewing in her lap. Sarah's hands stilled on the fabric. "His name was Thomas. He was a traveling merchant. He promised to come back for me, but he didn't. No. I waited 6 months before I finally understood that he wouldn't." Sarah's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "I was foolish to believe him. You were young. Young people believe in promises. Do you think I'm a bad person, James? For what I did?" James looked at her for a long moment. "I think you're a woman who made a mistake and paid a high price for it. That doesn't make you bad. It makes you human." The kindness in his voice made Sarah's throat tight. "I never expected this. Any of this." "What did you expect? To raise my baby alone, to struggle, to always be marked as a fallen woman." She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. "I never expected to find a partner. We're partners, aren't we?" Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. The quiet strength in his face, the way he never made her feel like a burden, the gentle way he'd helped her transform from a desperate woman walking the prairie into someone who belonged somewhere. "Yes," she said. "We are." As November approached, Sarah's pregnancy advanced. James hired Mrs. Cooper, the town's midwife, to check on her regularly. The baby was healthy and strong, Mrs. Cooper reported, and Sarah glowed with the knowledge that she was creating life in safety and security. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah felt the baby kick particularly hard. Without thinking, she reached for James's hand and placed it on her belly. "Feel that?" James's eyes widened as he felt the movement beneath his palm. That's really something. The baby's active at night. I think it's going to be a night owl like its father." "Its father?" James's voice was soft. "Yes, its father." Sarah covered his hand with both of hers. "This baby is going to know you as its father, James. That makes you its father, no matter what anyone else says." James's throat worked as he swallowed hard. "I promise I'll be good to both of you. I'll provide for you, protect you, love this child as my own. I know you will." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "And James, I want you to know that I'm grateful every day that you found me on that road. You saved my life." "No," James said, his hand still pressed to her belly, feeling the life moving within. "You saved mine." The baby was born on a cold December morning after a long night of labor. James paced the kitchen while Mrs. Cooper attended to Sarah upstairs, his hands clenched into fists as he listened to the sounds from above. When the baby's cry finally pierced the air, James sank into a chair, his legs suddenly weak with relief. Mrs. Cooper appeared at the top of the stairs, beaming. "It's a girl," she announced, "strong and healthy. Mother's doing fine too." James climbed the stairs on unsteady legs and found Sarah propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby had dark hair and Sarah's delicate features, but when she opened her eyes, James saw something that made his breath catch. "She's perfect," he whispered, settling carefully on the edge of the bed. "Do you want to hold her?" Sarah asked. James had never held a baby before, but Sarah showed him how to support the head, how to cradle the small body against his chest. The baby looked up at him with serious dark eyes, and James felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. "What should we name her?" he asked. "I was thinking Hope Morrison." James smiled, tears blurring his vision. "Hope Morrison. I like that." As spring arrived, the Morrison farm bloomed with new life. Hope grew strong and healthy, her laughter filling the house that had been silent for so long. Sarah watched James with their daughter, marveling at the gentle way he spoke to her, the careful way he held her, the pride that lit up his face when neighbors commented on how beautiful she was. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold, Hope sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, James reached over and took her hand. "I need to tell you something," he said. Sarah's heart skipped. "What is it?" "I love you, Sarah, not just as a partner, not just as the mother of my daughter. I love you as a woman, as my wife." He squeezed her hand. "I know that wasn't part of our arrangement, but I needed you to know." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "James, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that this isn't just gratitude or convenience for me anymore. You've become everything to me." Sarah shifted Hope to one arm and reached up to touch James's face. "I love you too. I think I started falling for you that first night, when you saw me as a person worth saving instead of just a problem to solve." James leaned down and kissed her, soft and sweet, while their daughter slept between them and the prairie wind whispered through the grass. It was a perfect moment, the kind that makes all the pain and struggle that came before seem worthwhile. As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Sarah thought about the woman who had walked across the prairie 9 months ago, desperate, alone, convinced her life was over. That woman could never have imagined this moment, this feeling of belonging, this sense of home. "Thank you," she whispered against James's lips. "For what? For seeing me, for choosing me, for giving me a reason to hope." James smiled, his forehead pressed against hers. "Thank you for letting me love you both." Hope stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft baby sounds, and both parents looked down at her with wonder. She was living proof that even in the harshest circumstances, life could surprise you with its capacity for renewal, for second chances, for love that grows in the most unexpected places. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, vast and wild and full of possibility, and in the circle of James's arms, with their daughter between them, Sarah Morrison finally understood what it meant to be home. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the Morrison farm as the morning sun painted the Nebraska sky in shades of rose and gold. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, her hands busy kneading bread dough, watching as 7-year-old Hope chased 3-year-old Samuel around the chicken coop, while baby Martha gurgled contentedly in her cradle nearby. "Hope, don't let your brother terrorize the chickens," Sarah called out, though her voice carried more amusement than stern warning. "Yes, Mama." Hope's voice rang clear across the yard, and Sarah smiled at the easy way the word came from her daughter's lips. There had never been any question about who her parents were. James had been the only father Hope had ever known, and their bond was as strong as any blood connection could be. The kitchen door creaked open, and James entered, carrying a pail of fresh milk and wearing the contented expression of a man who had found his place in the world. At 42, he had gained a few grey hairs at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes, but the quiet strength that had drawn Sarah to him remained unchanged. "Samuel's got Bessie all worked up again," he said, setting the milk on the counter. "Boy's got more energy than a Mustang." "He gets that from his father," Sarah teased, accepting the kiss James pressed to her cheek. "Remember when you used to work from dawn to dusk just to keep yourself from thinking too much? Now I work from dawn to dusk to keep up with my children," James replied, his hand finding its familiar place on the small of her back. Much better reasons. The past 7 years had transformed them both. Sarah had blossomed from the frightened, desperate woman who had once walked the prairie alone into a confident mother and respected member of their community. She had helped establish the town's first school, organize quilting circles for the women, and become known for her skill with difficult births, having assisted Mrs. Cooper with several deliveries before the elderly midwife retired. James had evolved from a solitary man hiding from his grief into a pillar of the community. He served on the town council, helped struggling families get established, and had become known for his fairness and wisdom. Their farm had prospered, expanding to include additional acreage and a small apple orchard that Sarah had convinced him to plant. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Sarah said, turning the dough out onto the floured surface. "She wanted to know if we'd consider taking in the Peterson boy." James paused in his morning routine. "The one whose parents died in the accident?" "Tommy, yes, he's only 12, but he's been living rough since the funeral. Mrs. Henderson says he's too proud to accept charity, but he might accept work." "What did you tell her?" Sarah's hands stilled on the dough. "I told her I'd talk to my husband. But James, that boy reminds me of someone who was once walking alone and needed someone to see their worth." James studied his wife's face, seeing the compassion that had never dimmed despite all the hardships she'd endured. "You want to take him in? I want to give him what you gave me, a chance to belong somewhere." Before James could respond, the sound of hoofbeats in the yard drew their attention. Through the window, they saw a familiar figure dismounting from a well-traveled horse, Thomas Patterson, Sarah's brother-in-law, whom she hadn't seen since that day 7 years ago, when his wife had banished her from their wagon. Sarah's face paled, but James moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. "You don't have to see him if you don't want to." "No," Sarah said, straightening her shoulders. "I think I do." Thomas approached the house slowly, his hat in his hands, looking older and more weathered than Sarah remembered. When James opened the door, Thomas's eyes moved between them, taking in the obvious prosperity of the farm, the sounds of children playing, the way Sarah stood confidently beside her husband. "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, I wanted to speak with you." "Come in," James said, though his voice carried a note of protective caution. Thomas entered the kitchen, his eyes widening as he took in the warm, lived-in space. The children's drawings pinned to the walls, the family photographs on the mantel, the obvious signs of a happy home. His gaze lingered on baby Martha, who was just beginning to fuss in her cradle. "3 children," he said, wonder in his voice. "Hope, Samuel and Martha," Sarah said, moving to lift the baby. "This is my husband, James Morrison." The 2 men shook hands, and Thomas's eyes showed his surprise at James's firm grip and steady gaze. Whatever he had expected to find, it wasn't this scene of domestic contentment. "I came to..." Thomas began, then stopped, struggling with the words. "Margaret died last winter. Fever took her." Sarah felt a pang of genuine sadness. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Despite everything, she was my sister. Before she died, she asked me to find you, to make sure you were all right." Thomas's voice broke slightly. "She regretted what we did, how we left you." "We all make choices," Sarah said gently. "Some we regret, some we don't." Thomas looked around the kitchen again, then back at Sarah. "She was wrong about you. We were wrong. I can see that now. You've built something good here." "Yes, Sarah said, her arm tightening around her baby. "We have. I have some things that belong to your mother," Thomas said, reaching into his satchel. "Margaret wanted you to have them." He pulled out a small wooden box and a faded photograph. "And this is a picture of all of us before." Sarah looked at the photograph. Herself at 17, standing between her parents, her sister beside her with a rare smile. It felt like looking at strangers. That girl she had been seemed so far away from the woman she had become. "Thank you," she said, accepting the items. "Would you like to stay for breakfast? Meet your nieces and nephew properly?" Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that very much." As the morning progressed, Sarah watched Thomas interact with her children, saw him taking in the easy affection between her and James, the obvious love that filled every corner of their home. When Hope climbed onto James's lap and began chattering about her plans for the day, Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "She doesn't know," he said quietly to Sarah as they stood together on the porch. "Know what?" "That James isn't her biological father." Sarah's chin lifted. "James is her father in every way that matters. She's never needed to know anything else." Thomas nodded slowly. "You're right. Family isn't always about blood, is it?" "No," Sarah agreed. "It's about choice, about commitment, about showing up every day and choosing to love someone." Before Thomas left, he shook James's hand again. "Thank you for taking care of her, for giving her the life she deserved. She gave me just as much as I gave her," James replied. "Maybe more." That evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, Hope chattering about her day, Samuel making elaborate stories about his adventures, baby Martha contentedly nursing, Sarah felt the weight of how far they had all come. "James," she said later, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars appear in the vast Nebraska sky, "I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about Tommy Peterson, and I think we should ask him to come work for us, help him get on his feet." James smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. I already talked to him this afternoon. He'll start Monday." Sarah laughed. "You knew I'd say yes. I knew my wife has a heart big enough for any child who needs a home." Udim, as they sat together in the comfortable darkness, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 7 years ago, she had been walking across this same prairie, pregnant and alone, certain her life was over. Now she was surrounded by family, respected in her community, and married to a man who loved her completely. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment. "I try not to think about it, but I know this. You would have survived. You would have found a way. You're stronger than you know." "We both are," Sarah said, taking his hand. "We're stronger together." Hope appeared in the doorway, her dark hair tousled from sleep. "Mama, I had a dream about a lady walking in the dust. She looked sad." Sarah's breath caught. "What happened to her in your dream?" "A man on a horse found her, and then she wasn't sad anymore." Hope climbed onto Sarah's lap. "Was that you and Papa?" Sarah exchanged a look with James, amazed by their daughter's intuition. "Yes, sweetheart, that was us." "I'm glad he found you," Hope said, settling against her mother's chest. "Otherwise I wouldn't be here." "No," Sarah said, kissing her daughter's head. "None of us would be here, but we are, and that's what matters." As the night deepened around them, the Morrison family sat together on their porch, surrounded by the endless prairie that had once seemed so threatening, but now felt like home. They had built something lasting from the dust and desperation of that first meeting, a love that had grown from necessity into something beautiful, a family that had chosen each other as much as they had been chosen by fate. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow. And in the circle of her family's love, Sarah Morrison knew that every step of her journey, even the hardest ones, had led her exactly where she belonged.